So when I was a little girl, I really wanted a kitten for Christmas. And I told my parents this, and they said, we're not getting a kitten. And I said, I'm so excited for Christmas when I get a kitten. And on Christmas morning, I ran down the stairs, and I looked under the tree for this kitten that I was sure would be there. And I didn't have a kitten. And I was really disappointed. But what I did have were these 2 boxes, these 2 hefty presents, and they had some weight to them. They were a good size, and I thought, man, this is going to be good. It may not be a kitten, but this is going to be good. It'll be worth it. And so I'm all excited, and I rip open the paper, and inside these boxes I find books. Not these ones. I wasn't this old yet. But I can't tell you how disappointed I was to open that present and find books. At the time, I didn't like to read. I was not interested in it. I did not enjoy it. But I had the Magic Treehouse series. That's what I received that Christmas. And my mom started reading it to me that year. And I got really excited. I enjoyed it. I loved the stories. And that set me off to be a voracious reader. I ate up every book I could get my hands on. I was consistently reading above my level because I just kept seeking out these stories that I really, really loved. And I was growing and growing and growing in my reading until around middle or early high school, I reached young adult literature, and then I started to plateau. I started reading young adult literature, and then I stayed there. And now I'm 23 years old. And I still love to read young adult literature, like these 2 books right here. Except that at 23 years old, or at 33 years old, or 53 years old, it's not exactly a well-respected choice to read a lot of young adult literature. There's a bit of a stigma that comes with it. It's seen as something that's not really meant for adults. It's great for younger readers, but it's not for us who are mature and older. That stigma is slowly breaking down, and certainly it doesn't stop the many millions of adults who do read young adult literature, but it still exists. Consider this quote that comes from an article published in the Slate in 2014. Adults should feel embarrassed about reading literature written for children. It continues to say that there's, of course, no shame in writing about teenagers, think Shakespeare. But crucially, YA books present the teenage perspective in a fundamentally uncritical way. It's not simply that YA readers are asked to immerse themselves in a character's emotional life. That's the trick of so much great fiction. But that they are asked to abandon the mature insights into that perspective that they supposedly have acquired as adults. This article addresses a key concept in why this stigma exists. It exists because we believe that fundamentally these books with juvenile perspectives are in some way lesser, that we as adults don't need to be reading them because they don't have the wisdom and the critique and the understanding of the world that we adults do have. But I have a problem with this statement. I have a problem with this concept. Why? Because it's not the truth, or at least it's not the whole truth. In order to really understand what we're talking about here, we first have to ask ourselves, okay, so what is young adult literature? It's not as simple a question to answer as you might think. The typical concept is that it's books that are for teenagers between 12 and 18 years old, maybe 19 years old. Okay, but what does it mean that a book is for a teenager? How is that any different from a book for an adult? Well, part of it might be the age of the characters, the age of the protagonists. Typically, young adult novels feature protagonists who are between 12 and 18, 13 and 19, that general range that matches the age of the readers. But it's not a hard and fast rule. The Goldfinch, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel of 2013, features for most of the book a teenage protagonist. That's not young adult fiction. Or Anne of Green Gables, which we consider now to be middle grades or young adults because the protagonist is 11 or 12 and we consider that the 11 or 12-year-olds who are her peers should be reading about her. When it was published in 1908, it was not considered young adult literature. There was no assumption that children would be reading it. It was published for adults. So the age of the characters is part of it, but it's not the whole story. What else is there? Well, there's the perspective, the voice that's presented. We can write books about teenagers, but what makes them special in the young adult world is that they're written with the teenage voice in mind. And it's true that young adult books capture the attention of teenagers because they really represent the way that they speak and they think. They communicate to teenagers in the way that teenagers are communicating amongst themselves. But we take it too far. Both publishers and critics agree that this is the case, but we take it too far when we start to think of it in terms of young adult literature is the realm of exclusively adolescent voices, which many critics would suggest, that it is the place where we only hear the perspective of teenagers, we only hear the perspective of youth. See, I don't think that's really the case, and I have a couple examples here. Let's look at them. This is Marcus Zuzak's The Book Thief. The story is of Liesel, who is growing up in Nazi Germany. The book takes place when she's from 9 to 15 years old, so she grows up during the course of the book. That space right there, 9 to 15, that perfectly falls within that range of young adult ages. But it does not present Liesel's perspective directly. The twist here is that Liesel experiences the story, and she's the main character. She's the protagonist, but she doesn't get to tell her story. Her story is told by a different narrator, by Death. Death is not human, and he's also not a teenager. He exists outside of time, and he's observed millennia of human lives. He has a vast expanse of understanding of the human condition because he has observed many millions of humans in their whole entire lives, and he finds it fascinating to study people. But what he doesn't have is that personal experience that comes along with being human, with living the life. And so he combines this youthful and mature adult voice because he has seen it all. He sees the things that make us mature as adults, and he has the wide perspective, the broad perspective to bring to Liesel's circumstances, but he doesn't have the empathy or the personal experience that comes with having lived through it himself. And that way he's very youthful. He's not immature, but he doesn't have the mature and aged perspective that comes with adulthood. In Death, we have this combination of youthful and adult with innocence and wisdom that are combined and brought together to give a more complete picture to Liesel's story. So we see here, Liesel's perspective starts. Liesel was sure this is what she sees, these are her observations, but it ends this passage with Death's own thoughts and analysis, things that Liesel doesn't know herself, things that Liesel doesn't see. He asks, how could that woman walk? How could she move? That's the sort of thing I'll never know or comprehend what humans are capable of. That's Death's understanding of this situation, far beyond what Liesel at age 9 or even at age 15 could have analyzed on her own. Or another example. This comes from Jacob Have I Loved by Catherine Patterson. Here we have Louise, who is 13 through 15 during the time that the story is focusing on. And Louise does get to narrate her own story. She doesn't have this second narrator who's separate from her experience. But Louise doesn't tell us her story when she's 15 years old. She waits until she's in her 30s, and then she looks back on her life. And so the perspective that we get is of Louise reflecting on her childhood experience. We see her adolescence, but we see it through the wisdom of youth, or through the wisdom of adulthood, rather. So the phenomenon that we're looking at here is that it's almost impossible to extricate the adult perspective and the adult voice from a young adult text. Sure, it may be young adult, but that doesn't make it solely juvenile. It's almost impossible because the people who are authoring these texts are adults. What does a pure young adult voice look like? It looks like a teenager talking. But all these texts are written by adults. The only pure young adult voices that we have in literature will be those that are written by teenagers themselves, like The Diary of Anne Frank. But that's not typical. That's the exception, not the norm. The majority of the books are written by adults. It's a phenomenon that's been observed in children's literature by the critic Perry Nodelman. He looked at children's literature to see the hidden adult that underlies all these books. Yes, we look at them and you have this child who's the protagonist, the child who's the main character, and we think that's the child's perspective. but it's written by this adult, so what we're really seeing is adults' expectations and ideals of children that are placed into this child created by an adult. And it looks like we're seeing a child's perspective, but in reality we're seeing what adults think of as a child's perspective. The same goes for young adult literature, that we look like we're seeing a young adult's perspective, but in reality we're getting that perspective as qualified by an adult's wider realm of experience. So the difference being in children's books, it's typically hidden. We don't get to see that adult perspective. And in the two examples I've just shown you, it's even highlighted. It's not hidden at all. We're constantly qualifying the limitations of youth with the broader context of adulthood so that both are brought together in a beautiful way to give a fuller picture of the experience. The bottom line here, I asked, why is it a problem when we're talking about the juvenile voices in young adult literature? Well, the first problem is because those voices aren't solely juvenile. It's basically impossible and honestly undesirable for us to completely pull out that mature adult perspective. And so when we make statements suggesting that young adult novels are entirely juvenile things that don't have that qualifying context, that's simply not true. But to return to that question that I started with of why I consider it problematic when we say that adults shouldn't be reading young adult texts because they're simply juvenile perspectives that don't have the broader wisdom that we as adults have gained in the world, that they're simply pleasure reading. They see the world in an uncritical manner. I consider that statement problematic because when we start to suggest that a certain kind of voice is not worth reading, we're making a statement about that voice speaking in reality. If we're not willing to read these stories, how can we be willing to listen to these experiences? If we're not willing to read the stories that reflect the experiences of teenagers, what kind of attention are we giving to those teenagers themselves when they try to share their experiences with us? In this article, in the Slate, we talk about how there's of course no shame in writing about teenagers. But the problem here, this highlights what I'm saying here, we suggest that it is okay for us to read things written about teenagers, but it's not okay for us to read things that are written through the eyes of teenagers. It's okay for us as adults to come back and say, I understand and I know what I know, and I will tell your story the way I tell it. But it's not okay for us to go in and say, I want to empathize with you. I want to see through your eyes. I want to remember what it is like to be in your shoes. And that's why I believe that it's not by no means bad, it's even good for us adults to come back and to read young adult literature again, because it can give us greater empathy and compassion and greater ability to reach out to the teenagers around us in our own lives. They're not just stories, they're real live human beings. So where do we go from here? What do we do? Maybe you, like me, love young adult literature and you just can't wait to get your hands on that next young adult novel and tear through it, or maybe that doesn't float your boat at all. Either way, that's fine. We should all have the freedom to read whatever we like to read, whatever we enjoy to read, whatever gets us interested and excited and makes us think. But I want to leave you with a challenge. I want you to really consider why you're reading what you're reading. Why do you choose some stories over other stories? Not that it's good or it's bad, but why do you do it? Are you reading fiction or nonfiction? Are you reading books for children or young adults or adults? Are you reading fantasy or mystery or contemporary realism? Are you reading the next bestseller or the first book by an unknown author? Are you reading stories that reflect your own experiences, or are you reading stories that reflect those of other people of different races and cultures and countries? Whatever you're reading, whatever we choose to read, that's a reflection of our value of certain stories in the world. So what statements are we making about the people that we value around us? And the next time that you have a friend who comes up to you, like me, all excited to tell you about the new young adult novel that they're just so excited to read, take a pause before you roll your eyes and sigh, because maybe, just maybe, there's something in that book for you too. Thank you.